The Edmonton Oilers enter the 2025 season with more uncertainty than they've had in recent years. On today's episode of Locked On Oilers, why that uncertainty is going to be the difference between finally winning a Stanley Cup and another disappointing playoff run.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This upcoming October will be my 10th season doing digital hockey content, my 4th with the Locked On Podcast Network, and I cannot thank you enough for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every day. In today's show, we round out our series, the 5 biggest storylines facing the Oilers as they enter the 2025 season. On Monday, we addressed the goal scoring quandary. Tuesday, we addressed how they were going to handle an increased defensive responsibility in the team's success. Wednesday, we debated if Stuart Skinner was cooked. Yesterday, we talked about Chris Knoblauch's need to evolve, in particular, coaxing more offense out of this group. And today, we rounded out by addressing the unknown known. And context: former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld in the United States, famously talking about the war in Iraq, said there are known knowns, unknown knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And that very straightforwardly means we know there are things we do not know. For the Oilers this upcoming season, their unknown known is their young guys. It's Matthew Savoie. It is Ike Howard. I would put Vasily Podkolzin in here as well. I would put Ty Emberson in here as well, but to lesser extents. So to start things out, we're going to lay out where the opportunity for those guys in the lineup is and the potential upside. Our second segment, we're going to talk about why that upside matters. And then to round it all out, we're going to talk about that within the context of the expectations for this team as we start talking about actual hockey. So to lay the foundation, to lay the groundwork, last year, the Oilers were the oldest average age team in the NHL. You think about, yes, Corey Perry does juice your overall average age by having him in your mix, but this was a veteran-laden team. They consciously chose Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson over Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway. This is a team that opted to keep Adam Henrique into his mid-30s. This is a team that said, okay, we lost the Stanley Cup final. We need to play a certain way. We need to try and create more offense to be able to eventually win that Stanley Cup. And real quick, as an aside, yes, I do fundamentally believe the Oilers thought they would be able to keep Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg on their respective qualifying offers. The Oilers never suspected that either guy would get an offer sheet, particularly a tantalizing one from a team like the Blues. So I think there's a world where if things work out the way they were designed, you have Dylan Holloway on last year's Oilers. And I think that's a very different looking team. And we'd be having a very different conversation right now as far as where the upside in this lineup is. And I was talking about it with Haley Simon of Locked On Blues yesterday. I did a hit on Locked On Blues for Thursday. You need upside in your lineup. And that's not to say you can't win with an older team. Florida only had a handful of young guys, Mackie Samsovic on the younger end. Anton Lundell is still relatively young, even though he's not on his entry-level contract anymore. But by and large, teams that win the Stanley Cup don't feature young guys unless they're special. Cale Makar on the Avalanche, that's an extreme outlier. That is not something that happens all that often, where you have a 22, 21-year-old playing such a key role at such a young age. But for the Oilers, the way you look at this lineup, we know we're going McDavid, Draisaitl down the middle for the most part. Those two will, of course, overlap in important situations, maybe for prolonged stretches if the offense is really having a hard time and Chris Knoblauch says, okay, I just got to get something. But we know we're going McDavid. We know we're going Draisaitl. Okay, here's your first inflection point. Does Ryan Nugent-Hopkins go to third-line center, or does he go to first-line left wing? If he goes to third-line center, the path to Matthew Savoie or Ike Howard in the top 6 is very straightforward. There is an available spot for the taking. But let's say Nuge plays first-line left wing. Okay. Is one of them going to be on McDavid's right? Well, once Zach Hyman comes back from his broken wrist, that spot's not going to be there. So if Chris Knoblauch leans on his familiar habit of leaning on experience I would expect to see Zach Hyman, McDavid, Nugent-Hopkins. So what does that do to Andrew Mangiapane? Well, that bumps him down a spot. That means maybe he plays on Draisaitl's right and they bring Podkolzin back, or maybe that means Mangiapane's on the left and Trent Frederick's on the right. And then really quickly, you start to get a picture as to how Ike Howard or Matthew Savoie or both might get frozen out of key contribution spots. And it is imperative in this first real taste of National Hockey League experience that these guys get their feet under them. I'm not saying they need to put up stats. I'm not even saying they need to play well. They just need to play. You don't know what you have until you play. And it creates a really conflicting relationship there. The more a player plays, the more information you have about them, the better you understand them. Maybe you're able to channel what they're good at and produce better and get them to play better. But you also increase the volatility. You also increase the risk. For example, we've talked about this a lot in regards to Stuart Skinner, range of outcomes. Connor McDavid's range of outcomes are pretty narrow. At worst, he's going to give you 90 points. At best, he can give you 140 points. When we're talking about a guy like Ike Howard, he could give you 5 goals. He could give you 25 goals. Now, I'm not saying 25 goals is likely, but it's within the realm of possibility that Ike Howard lights it up next year, that he plays with McDavid or he plays with Draisaitl or both, and he sneaks onto the first power play. I could say the same thing about Matthew Savoie. There's a world where Matthew Savoie jumps into the lineup next year and gives the Oilers 25 points. There's a world where Matthew Savoie jumps into the lineup and he gives you 65 points. That's where context and that's where situation matters. And we talk about this all the time. My everydayers have heard me say this all summer. The single biggest way to juice someone's counting stats is to play them more. That's why whenever we do a player evaluation, the first thing we talk about, how much ice time do they get? Are they on a power play? Are they on a penalty kill? Who's on their line with them? Are they on a first or a second line? Or are they a third liner? Do they get favorable deployments against the other team's worst players, or they match up? Are they playing the other team's best players? There are several contextual factors to consider when we're evaluating counting stat production. It's why counting stats are not the best measure of how good a player is. Yeah, they're good for a quick glance. Okay, he had 100 points in 81 games last year. He's good. Yeah, that's really easy to tell. But you can have a 45-point season on a good team as a third-line player, and that could be more valuable than a 60-point season from a second liner on a bad team. It's one of the great tropes in sports. Is he a good player on a bad team, or is he just a good player? There are plenty of guys who put up nice stats playing big roles on bad teams where they can let their bad habits foster. They can play how they want to play to produce those counting stats, and it puts you as a player, as a team, in an awkward position where you don't really know how good a guy is, especially if efficiency doesn't matter. Because if the team's not good, you can let him do those things. I point to that Erik Karlsson Norris Trophy with San Jose a couple of years ago where the Sharks were a miserable hockey team, but he put up 100 points. And as a defenseman, that got you a Norris Trophy. It really is that straightforward sometimes in understanding these situations. But the last point to make here, and I would be remiss, I did mention Podkolzin, and Ty Emberson. I should also mention David Tomasek, who led the Swedish league in points last year, who is a real dart throw. There's a world where Tomasek is playing third or fourth line right wing. There's a world where Tomasek's back in Europe next year. And you won't know until he gets in the mix. And he's one of the few guys that this preseason is going to matter for. Savoie, Howard, the preseason is going to matter for them. Ty Emberson, Troy Stecher, it'll matter for them. But for the most part, when you are a veteran locked team the way the Oilers are, you don't have a lot of spots up for grabs. You don't have a lot of opportunity. But that opportunity, to tease what's coming up next, I'm going to tell you why having that upside, having that potential is so crucial to where the Oilers want to go right after this break. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's where our friends at Monarch Money come in. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or phone. Monarch is built for people with busy lives. If you've put off organizing your finances or you're anxious about it, Monarch is here for you. Monarch does all of the heavy lifting. You can link your accounts in minutes, see clear data visualizations, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money. And you'll never touch a spreadsheet. Something Monarch made me aware of was I'm not doing the best of job of planning for my big purchases. I've been financing them and paying them off over time. Monarch gets me on track for those big purchases. These headphones, they weren't cheap. Monarch put me on a plan and got me to the total I needed to buy them without needing to finance them. Do not let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNHL. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers as we round out our storylines to define the season series. Next week, we will start doing individual position group and subsequently player previews to focus in on what we can realistically expect. But speaking of unknown knowns, the defining theme of this episode, potential and upside are paramount to eventual success. And that's not to say everybody's going to be playing well or at their best at the exact same time. More often than not, in a team sport, you're going to have players struggling, being okay, and thriving all simultaneously at the same time. And some are able to rise the tide for others. That's the McDavids, Draisaitl's, Bouchards. Some are just kind of what they are. They can take care of themselves, but they're not really going to drive play, make other players better. And then there are the guys who are going to drag the rest of the lineup down, that are going to harm the players they're out there with because they're just ineffective. And understanding this makes it seem like I'm talking about some nebulous idea, some grand concept. But in reality, you know what I'm talking about when we're talking about upside and potential. You're looking at a perfect example. If you drafted a fantasy football team in the last few weeks, if you're going to draft a fantasy hockey team in the coming weeks, you probably have a list of guys that you were interested in who are a little lower profile, who, if things broke right for them, they could be your league winner. You know, you looked at an RJ Harvey and a Murray and Hampton. Maybe you looked at someone like Keon Coleman, you know, not expensive, not big upside. You're not going to draft them in the 4th, 5th round of a redraft. Or if you're talking about hockey, maybe you're looking at a young defenseman, somebody who has power play upside on a mediocre to bad team who's going to get a lot of opportunities to accumulate points. That's the way I'm talking about the Oilers right now. You know, to some degree, where you're getting from Connor, where you're going to get from Leon, from Bouchard, from Jake Wallman. Those are established guys with long track records. Notice, mention, I didn't say Zach Hyman. I didn't say Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. I didn't say Adam Henrique. I didn't say Darnell Nurse. I didn't say Matthias Ekholm. Those 5 guys are older. They have a bit more volatility. Even though they're all established NHL players, reasonable track records, you have a potential range of outcomes. Maybe this is the year Zach Hyman falls off. Maybe this is the year Ryan Nugent-Hopkins falls off. Last year might have been the first year of Adam Henrique's decline. And those are considerations to have when talking about the capacity for a team to reach its ceiling. And if you're an everydayer, if you were watching episodes last year, you saw me do this gesture a lot, talking about you got to start here to get here to get here. Because if you want to get out of frame, you know, if you want to win the Stanley Cup, at a certain point, you need to be about here. And then you make that leap. And that's the capacity of potential. It's why we get married to draft picks. It's why we get married to prospects. We love that they can be anything. Ike Howard could be Nikita Kucherov. Matthew Savoie could be Mitch Marner. They're not, but they could. And that is the tantalizing possibility offered by having assets, by having draft picks, by having prospects. There is just so much unknown. And we as humans, we like to think about the good outcome. When we buy a lotto ticket, we think we're going to win. When we apply for a job, we think we're going to get it. We don't consider the alternative. You know, last week, the Powerball number was insane. It was over $1 billion. And I was at a dinner party and only 2 of the people in the room had the lottery ticket, but everybody was talking about what we were going to do as a group if one of the 2 people won. You know, you got a better chance of being struck by lightning than winning the Powerball, but we think about the good outcome. We think about, well, Ike Howard won the Hobie Baker last year. He's going to come in here. He's going to play with McDavid or Draisaitl. He's going to get on the first power play. He's going to score 25 goals. He's going to be a Calder finalist. He's going to be instrumental. He's going to have a coming out party and put himself on the map and be instrumental in the Oilers answering some of their goal scoring questions. Ditto for Matthew Savoie. He's going to come in here. He's going to be a quality playmaker. Maybe he gets the Nugent-Hopkins spot on the power play, and that changes some of the formulation as far as how the counting stats get allocated. But make no mistake, the Oilers are short here in terms of proven offense. We talked about it on Monday. We talked about it to some extent on Tuesday. We talked about it yesterday, too, that as the team has become more low event, they've become a bit more of a cycle team, a bit more of a high to low team, where the offense isn't as efficient. You're not getting as many pucks on net. You are playing lower event hockey in the hopes that Connor or Leon can swing that game at even strength. We talked about the repercussions of that you're getting lower quality shots, that you're not generating as many power plays, and you are, in effect, neutering your offense to play better defense. And that's not a terrible trade-off. You know, the Oilers did make the Stanley Cup final last year with that mentality of being a bit more of a defense-first team. We know how much Connor McDavid gets annoyed whenever people ask him, are you surprised how good the defense was? And no, Connor says, no, we're a good defensive team. I don't know where this perception of us comes from. And really, it's an interesting question, but at the same time, it's based on the evidence. The Oilers' track record up until the last 2 years was a high-flying, dynamic offense that scored a lot but gave back just as much as it created. Now, knowing you're a bit more defined, that you play a bit better defense, that you have maybe a more talented defensive group top to bottom than forward group top to bottom, it's only natural that you're going to skew your team towards its strengths. You know, you're going to focus a bit more on defense and then have Connor and Leon do the things that make them special. And that's really one of the great luxuries the Oilers have here. And I read it in The Athletic on Thursday. There was a feature in there, the top 10 players most likely to win the Calder. And every other slot was just an individual player. Slot number 9 was Ike Howard / Matthew Savoie, with the reasoning being one of these two guys will spend significant time with Connor McDavid or Leon Draisaitl this upcoming season. Anytime you play with a player of those caliber, they have the capacity to elevate you. They have the capacity to coax great production out of you. And that's not an indictment. You know, there are plenty of good supporting cast guys who are better as Robins than Batmans, especially in hockey, where play driving is such a hard skill, where not that many guys across the league would be considered strong drivers of play. But if you're Ike Howard and you really only got to worry about scoring goals and being defensively responsible and then playing with Connor or Leon, the formula is pretty easy here. The recipe for a successful Ike Howard season or a successful Matthew Savoie season, it's pretty straightforward. Put up the counting stats, figure out the kinks, get your defense down, and suddenly the recipe is pretty straightforward. But of course, we are talking about something we do not know. Ike Howard has never played in an NHL game. Matthew Savoie has like 30 career minutes at the NHL level, if even that. The Oilers have a lot of questions about the direction of their long-term future. Yeah, to be fair, fact check. Matthew Savoie has 53 minutes played across 5 games, so he's about 10 minutes per game. The Oilers have an opportunity here. If one of these guys hits, you solve a big problem. And coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, we're going to talk about what that problem is in terms of not just this year, but the runway into the future. Right after this. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new FanDuel customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use on the FanDuel app. I love FanDuel because it fits however you want to play. Props, same game parlays for a squad ride, my personal favorite. Or if the game already started and you just got a feeling, you got an itch, live betting makes it happen. We had a decent slate in the NFL. Joe Flacco revenge game against the Ravens. We might see Jackson Dart's NFL debut against the Cowboys. Oh yeah? Eagles Chiefs, Super Bowl rematch, 4:00 East Coast time. Maybe you might be interested. FanDuel is the best way to add a little bit more juice to your football Sunday. And FanDuel has a question for you. Are you ready? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet. Thank you so much to everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. The storyline series was interesting to put together, and I really do feel these themes are going to keep cropping up over the course of the year. And I think there's a few, the goaltending and the rookies, that are a bit more volatile, at least in terms of narrative. It's a lot easier for people to point and say, that guy won the Hobie Baker last year. How come he has 3 points and it's December? It's very easy to do that. If Stuart Skinner's save percentage is .893 and it's the end of November, it's really easy for people to point at that and say, well, how could the Oilers do this? How could they come into the season with the tandem together? And that's why we do this now. The work, it's just like the pros, man. You start your work now so you have an idea of what's to come. And maybe there are problems or storylines I'm not thinking of. Maybe there are considerations for players I'm not taking that seriously. Maybe Adam Henrique just had a down year. Maybe Nuge just had a down year. Maybe Zach Hyman, once he's healthy, he's going to look the part. And there's no way to know until you know. They got to play the games. And the undercurrent of this conversation is it's not just about this year, especially when it comes to Howard and Savoie. You could put Emberson in here, Podkolzin in, sure. The Oilers are trying to prolong their window of contention. I would dare to say the Oilers' window is probably closing. I'm not ready to say they can't win the Stanley Cup at all, but I do think it would take a lot more to go right this year than each of the previous two. I think this group is old. It's expensive. And that is where the young guys come in so crucial. Part of the reason you keep your guys is you understand how hard it is to get cheap, young talent. You do the hard work. You identify the player. In the case of Savoie and Howard, the scouting departments did. They traded for both guys, and they did the work. Savoie spent last year in the AHL. Howard has been in college the last couple of years. Those are the development years. That's the hard part of this. Now you have these guys in the fold. The only thing preventing you from playing these guys is you. You don't have any excuses about their deployment or their development now. You need to get these guys in your lineup. And this is the key to maintaining a contender window for an extended period of time. The Bruins win the Stanley Cup in 2011. They get back to the final in 2013. But slowly but surely, they start leaking guys out. Then, slowly but surely, Torrey Krug, Charlie McAvoy, David Pastrnak. That next wave, Rask takes over for Tim Thomas. That next wave of guys incrementally comes in. Trent Frederick comes to mind in there as well. Brad Marchand goes from depth guy to star. You make timely trades. You bring in pieces like Hampus Lindholm, like Linus Ullmark. And you have two windows of contention with Bergeron, Marchand, Chara. Washington, they were in the mix forever. They won President's Trophies. They only got past the second round one time. It was the year they won the Stanley Cup final. What happened after that? They hadn't won a playoff. They still haven't won a playoff series since they won the Stanley Cup final. But you think about it right now. Washington got through to the other side. Then look, post Ovechkin, they're going to have a reckoning to figure out who their next guy is going to be. Whether that's Protas, whether that's maybe somebody a little bit lower in the pecking order who has to develop a little bit more. But the Capital, it took them a while. Don't get me wrong. The Capitals have successfully transitioned to their new core. Dylan Strome, Tom Wilson, Protas, McMichael. That is the core of that team now. The Stars arguably have done this the best of anyone in the NHL. They had that cohort around Tyler Seguin, Jamie Benn, John Klingberg, Ben Bishop. We're 6-7 years past that now, and you have Heiskanen, and you have Hintz, and you have Harley, and you trade for Mikko Rantanen, and you draft Jake Ottinger, and they stick the landing. And Seguin and Ben are still useful down the lineup pieces. And I'm using those comps because my assumption, and I've maintained this position and will continue to maintain this position, McDavid's not leaving. So if you have McDavid, Draisaitl, and Bouchard, how do you stick the landing? How do you keep giving them chances? Well, you need to get talent, young, unproven talent, or low upside, high floor, high upside veterans. Guys like Jeff Skinner, guys like Victor Arvidsson. Those are your two paths to getting more talent when you're an old, expensive team. I would venture to say gambling on young guys in trades like Savoie and Howard is a better risk proposition than bringing in an older, expensive guy. Yeah, you had to give up prospects. You had to trade Ryan McLeod to get Savoie. You had to trade O'Reilly to get Ike Howard. But those guys now, Howard and Savoie, are ready. It is a matter of Chris Knobloch giving them a chance. And look, it's not going to be easy. The learning curve going from college to the NHL is going to be rough on Howard. You know, he's got to bulk up. He's got to work on his skating. He's got to get up to game speed. Savoie put together a really nice AHL season last year. The NHL is harder. But the Oilers do have some nice pieces. And that's the key here. If these young guys hit, you're buying more time. Because if Howard and Savoie hit, okay, we don't need to go get another top six forward in the near future. You know, if Zach Hyman falls off, if Nuge falls off, we can fill that spot internally. That's one less thing we need. It'll be cheaper because it's filled in internally. And that's the way you got to think about long-term roster planning. It's not just enough to be good right now. It's okay. If we're bad for a year, what's the next iteration look like? And the Oilers are going to have a lot of questions. Ekholm, Wallman, Skinner, all free agents after this year. Adam Henrique is a free agent after this year. Zach Hyman and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins have several years remaining on their contracts, but are they still going to be effective into their mid-late 30s? Those are questions the Oilers need to address. Savoie and Howard hitting solves those problems to some degree because, you know, if they're both at least second-line caliber players, okay, then the Oilers got to go and find third-liners, and it's easier to find third-liners than second-liners than first-liners. All of this is downstream of each other, and I think a lot of the perception of how these guys perform this year is going to be tied to their counting stats because, like we said before, counting stats are really the snapshot way of evaluating. Okay, Savoie had 45 points in 82 games. He was half a point per game player. He got some time with Leon. He got some time with Connor. He snuck onto the power play from February to the end of the year. He had a nice little streak in there where he had 6 points in 10 games. And okay, you start to see the vision. And to close out this episode, I give you the mystery box anecdote from Family Guy, where he goes for the timeshare, where Peter Griffin goes for the timeshare meeting. The guy running the timeshare meeting says, you can either get a boat or you could get what's in the mystery box. And Peter says, I'll take the box. Lois, it could be anything. There could even be a boat in there. And Lois says, well, Peter, we could just take the boat and we know what the boat is. That's how prospects work. That is how upside prospects work. We could be having a conversation this time next year like, oh my God, those guys were terrible. They looked slow. The game looked too fast for them. They didn't play well, and the Oilers didn't score enough, and they had a depressingly down year. Or we could be having this conversation next year. Okay, Howard's ready to play with McDavid full-time. Savoie's ready to play with Leon full-time. And we won't know until we play the games, because that's the beauty of prospect development. Until there's actual blood in the water, you don't know. That will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. If you're over on YouTube, leave me a comment. Let me know, are there any storylines I'm not thinking of as far as the Oilers go? Check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night in the lead up to the NHL 100 project and the start of the regular season. I will see you guys on Monday. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. Until then, let's go Oilers.